On Thanksgiving morning, my own parents kicked me out into the freezing snow. My brother Brandon stood there with a smug grin, tossing my luggage onto the icy driveway, telling me to enjoy figuring life out on my own. Clutching the last document my grandmother ever gave me, I drove straight to the local credit union. The moment the branch manager reviewed my file, the color drained completely from his face. Without a word, he silently locked his office door. "Ma'am," he said, his voice trembling, "you really need to sit down. My name is Sydney. I'm 33 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my family treated me like hired help. Before I tell you how that locked door completely changed my life, do me a favor and let me know in the comments where you are watching this story from. And if you've ever had to stand up to a toxic family who took you for granted, please hit that like button and subscribe." At 8 in the morning, the massive kitchen in my parents' suburban Connecticut estate was already filled with the rich aroma of roasting turkey. I was busy basting the bird, my hands covered in butter and sage, having been awake since dawn to prepare this holiday feast. Suddenly, the heavy oak front door slammed open, sending a gust of bitter winter air howling through the house. I turned around to see my sister-in-law Monique, dragging my heavy winter suitcases across the polished hardwood floors. My brother, Brandon, followed right behind her, carrying the rest of my bags. Without offering a single word of explanation, Monique threw my suitcases straight out the open front door. They tumbled down the icy stone steps, landing with a heavy thud in a snowbank. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, dropping the basting brush onto the counter. My mother, Patricia, strolled into the kitchen, her silk robe tied flawlessly, holding a freshly brewed cup of coffee. She didn't even blink at the freezing air rushing into the entryway. Calmly walking over to the marble island, she slapped a piece of paper onto the countertop. It was an official 30-day eviction notice. "You're leaving," Patricia said, taking an elegant sip of her coffee. "Right now, get your coat." I stared at the paper, my mind racing as I tried to process the sheer audacity of the moment. I pay $2,500 a month to live in the guest house, and I've been doing it for 5 years, I shot back, my voice rising. You let Brandon and Monique live in the main house completely rent-free, and you're throwing me out into a blizzard on Thanksgiving morning? Patricia scoffed, looking me up and down as if I were a stranger who had just tracked mud across her spotless floors. That wasn't rent, Sydney. That was a housing fee, and let's be honest, you're just a glorified gardener. Brandon is a tech entrepreneur. He's closing $1 million seed funding round for his new app next week. He and Monique need the guest house to set up his executive home office. You can't expect them to host wealthy investors in a cramped spare bedroom. My father Richard walked in, adjusting the cufflinks on his expensive dress shirt. He barely glanced at the eviction notice on the counter. "Listen to your mother, Sydney. You aren't welcome here anymore. Your brother is about to make it big. We need this space cleared out today so the interior designers can start first thing tomorrow morning." "I am a high-end botanical designer," I argued, trying to control the furious shaking in my chest at their betrayal. "I design conservatory ecosystems for wealthy clients. I pay my own bills. Brandon hasn't held a real job in 4 years. He lives off your credit cards while pretending to be some tech genius." "Don't you dare talk about my husband that way," Monique snapped, marching back into the kitchen. Her beautiful dark skin practically glowed against the stark white cabinetry, but her face was twisted with pure hostility. She crossed her arms, her diamond rings catching the overhead lights. She loved enforcing the family hierarchy, playing the perfect wealthy wife while treating me like a servant. "That ugly truck of yours, filled with dirt and fertilizer, is an eyesore to the entire neighborhood. Leave the keys to the guest house on the counter and get off this property." My father stepped forward, pointing a harsh finger directly at my face. "Get out before I call the authorities and have you removed for trespassing." The sheer cruelty of it made me gasp. For years I had maintained this property, paid top dollar to live in a converted garage, and quietly built my business while they worshipped Brandon. He was the golden boy who could do no wrong, despite failing at 3 different startups and draining their savings. Now, just because he wanted a pretty office space to impress fake investors, I was being discarded like trash on a family holiday. Monique grabbed my winter boots from the entryway mat and threw them outside onto the icy driveway. "Have fun figuring life out on your own," Brandon smirked, leaning lazily against the doorframe. "Try not to freeze out there." They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg, to plead for a few more days, or to break down and apologize for the inconvenience I was causing. My mother watched me like a hawk, a smug look of satisfaction on her face, waiting for my inevitable surrender. Instead, I calmly wiped the butter off my hands with a dish towel. I didn't shed a single tear. I walked over to my purse resting on a dining chair and reached into the inside zipper pocket. My fingers brushed against thick parchment. It was a heavy envelope sealed with deep red wax, stamped with the family crest of my late grandmother, Josephine. Grandmother Josephine had been a self-made force of nature, a woman who built a real estate empire from scratch, and she had long since seen through my father's shallow obsession with status. A month before she passed away, she had pressed this envelope into my hands. "Only open this. If your father crosses a line, he can never walk back," she had whispered to me. "When he shows you exactly who he is, take this to Mr. Thorne at the downtown credit union." I pulled the envelope out, gripping it tightly. I looked around the massive kitchen, taking in my father's arrogant glare, my mother's cold smirk, my brother's lazy grin, and Monique's hostile stance. They had definitely crossed the line. "Keep the turkey," I said, my voice entirely empty of emotion. I grabbed my car keys from the counter and walked straight out the front door into the biting wind. I didn't look back as I trudged through the snow, picking up my boots and suitcases. I threw my luggage into the back of my truck, started the engine, and drove out past the estate's wrought iron gates. I didn't go to a hotel. I didn't pull over to cry. I drove straight to the main branch of the downtown credit union. Even though it was Thanksgiving morning, I knew Mr. Thorne, the senior branch manager and my grandmother's most trusted financial confidant, made it a habit to stay in his office on holidays to finalize year-end accounts. I parked my truck and marched up to the glass doors, knocking heavily until security let me in. Walking right past the empty teller lines, I headed straight for Mr. Thorne's office. It was time to find out exactly what my grandmother had left behind, and what kind of storm was about to hit my family. The truck's tires slipped slightly on the icy asphalt as I pulled into the credit union parking lot. The dashboard heater was blasting, but I could still feel the Thanksgiving morning chill deep in my bones. I gripped the steering wheel, taking a deep breath to steady myself. I was not going to let my family break me. Reaching for the heavy envelope with my grandmother's red wax seal on the passenger seat, I walked straight through the bank's automatic glass doors. The credit union was dead quiet, operating on a skeleton crew for the holiday morning. I bypassed the empty main teller lines and headed straight for the frosted glass office of Mr. Thorne. He was the senior branch manager, a meticulous man in his late 60s who had managed grandmother Josephine's finances for decades. When I pushed the door open, he looked up from his computer monitor, his brow furrowing in confusion at my sudden, unannounced arrival. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I dropped the heavy envelope right in the center of his spotless mahogany desk. "My father just served me a 30-day eviction notice and threw my bags into the snow," I stated, my voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline roaring through my veins. "Grandmother Josephine told me to bring this to you the second he crossed the line." Mr. Thorne stared at the deep crimson wax. He recognized the family crest pressed into it instantly. Reaching out, he broke the brittle seal and pulled out a thick sheet of parchment. I watched his eyes scan the handwritten text. He read it once, then he read it a second time. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking completely pale, his breath catching in his throat. He stood up so fast his heavy leather chair slammed into the wall behind him. Without saying a word, he walked over to the office window and pulled the blinds completely shut. Then he stepped over to the heavy glass door, turned the deadbolt with a sharp click, and turned to face me. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, solemn whisper, "you really need to sit down." I took a seat in the chair across from his desk, my pulse pounding in my ears. "What does it say?" I asked, leaning forward. "Did she leave me a secret fund to help me move?" Mr. Thorne let out a long breath that sounded like a humorless chuckle. "Sydney, your grandmother was an incredibly brilliant woman who knew exactly how greedy and financially reckless your father was. She knew he would eventually try to sacrifice you to fund your brother's constant failures. You don't need a moving fund, because you don't need to move. That estate belongs to you." I stared at him, absolutely certain I had misheard. "The estate isn't mine," I argued, shaking my head. "My parents inherited that $4 million property when she passed away 5 years ago. I'm just their tenant. I pay them rent for the guest house." Mr. Thorne shook his head firmly, placing his hands flat on the desk. "They never inherited the estate. Josephine placed the entire property into a blind trust, and you are the sole and exclusive beneficiary. Your parents were only granted a conditional life estate." That means they were legally allowed to live in the main house for the rest of their lives, provided they followed two very strict legal conditions. Condition number 1. They were never allowed to charge you a single penny to live on your own property. Condition number 2. They could never attempt to evict you or deny you access. The second your father handed you that official eviction notice this morning, he legally terminated his own right to live on that property. The room began to spin. The scale of the deception was mind-boggling. My parents had treated me like an annoying burden, a squatter on their land, when in reality they had been secretly living in a house that belonged entirely to me. "But the rent," I protested, gripping the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. "I wire $2,500 every month to the estate management account. They demanded it. They said I had to pay market rate or be thrown out on the street." Mr. Thorne turned his computer monitor around to face me. He clicked through a few screens, bringing up a bank ledger. "They never touched that money, Sydney, because they had no legal access to it. The routing number they gave you for that estate account is actually a high-yield investment portfolio Josephine set up exclusively in your name. Every time you paid rent, the bank automatically invested it for you. She designed it as a trap. If Richard ever tried to extort you, the money would build a safety net for your future." I looked at the bright green number sitting quietly at the bottom of the screen. I had over $175,000 in liquid cash, compounding daily. I wasn't a broke gardener starting from zero. I was a millionaire with a massive financial safety net. A fierce rush of satisfaction flared up in my chest. My parents thought they were draining me dry, but they had only forced me to save my own money. "I'm going back right now," I said, grabbing my purse from the floor. "I'm going to throw these documents in their faces and kick them out before they even carve the Thanksgiving turkey." "Sit down, Sydney," Mr. Thorne commanded, his tone suddenly turning incredibly sharp and urgent. The satisfaction in my chest vanished instantly at the look on his face. He wasn't smiling. In fact, he looked absolutely terrified. He reached into his bottom drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder marked with red rush tape. He slid it slowly across the polished desktop toward me. "The eviction notice is just the trigger that allows us to act," he explained grimly. "But that isn't even the worst thing your parents did this week." I opened the heavy folder. Inside lay a stack of banking documents. 48 hours ago, your father and mother applied for a $500,000 home equity line of credit against the estate, Mr. Thorne said, locking his eyes onto mine. They told the loan officer they needed the $500,000 in cash to fund Brandon's new tech startup. But because the property is locked in a blind trust, the bank's underwriting department flagged the application. They told your parents the loan couldn't be approved unless the primary beneficiary of the trust signed off as a guarantor. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. "I never signed any loan documents," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I would never give Brandon a single dime, let alone risk my property for his fake company." Mr. Thorne pointed a trembling finger at the bottom of the final page. "Then take a look at the signature line." I flipped to the last page of the heavy document. There, written in blue ink, was my name, forged perfectly with a sweeping, confident hand. My parents hadn't just tried to kick me out of my home. They had committed felony-level bank fraud, forging my signature to borrow $500,000 against a house they didn't even own, all to fund their golden boy's delusions. I stared at the blue ink on the final page of the loan application. It was a perfect forgery of my signature. My parents hadn't just stolen my peace of mind, they were actively trying to steal $500,000 in my name. Mr. Thorne immediately put a hold on the loan approval process and connected me with the most ruthless trust and estate litigation attorney in the city. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a corner suite at the downtown Marriott. My new attorney, Meredith, was an absolute powerhouse in a tailored charcoal pantsuit. For the past hour, she had been spreading copies of the blind trust, the property deed, and the fraudulent loan application across the glass coffee table. Meredith explained the severity of the situation with chilling precision. My parents had committed a serious crime. By charging me rent and launching a malicious eviction, they had violated the core terms of their life estate. The blind trust my grandmother had set up was ironclad. I was the sole legal owner of that $4 million property, and the very second that eviction notice hit the kitchen counter, their right to be there officially ended. Suddenly, my phone vibrated violently against the glass table. Then it vibrated again. A rapid, endless stream of notifications began flooding my screen, lighting up the dim hotel room. I picked it up and saw my Facebook app exploding with tags, mentions, and direct messages. Monique had just posted a video. I tapped the screen, and Monique's face appeared. She was standing in the grand dining room of my estate, holding a tissue against her perfectly made-up face. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked directly into the camera, her voice trembling for her audience. "My heart is just completely broken today," Monique sobbed to her followers. "I never thought I'd have to make a video like this on Thanksgiving. My toxic sister-in-law Sydney just had a complete mental breakdown. She ruined our family holiday, screamed at my elderly in-laws, stole cash right out of my mother-in-law's purse, and vanished into the snow. We are so worried about her. We just hope she gets the professional help she clearly needs. Please pray for our family as we try to pick up the pieces." My blood ran completely cold. The comment section below the video was a toxic wasteland of relatives and family friends tearing my reputation to shreds. Aunt Carol wrote that I had always been a bitter, jealous girl who couldn't handle Brandon's success. Cousin David commented that I was probably on substances and needed an intervention. People who had known me my entire life were calling me a disgrace, a thief, and a monster. They were rallying around Monique like she was a saint, while they sat comfortably in a house that legally belonged to me. It was an old trick. Growing up, whenever my parents or Brandon treated me terribly, they would immediately run to the rest of the family to twist the narrative, painting me as the unstable, difficult child to cover up their own cruelty. Monique had simply weaponized that old family dynamic for the digital age. Meredith watched the video over my shoulder, her expression unreadable. She pulled a legal pad from her briefcase. "Defamation and slander," she noted calmly. "We'll add that to the filing." Before I could even process the mountain of hateful comments, the video screen cut out, replaced by an incoming call. The caller ID flashed Brandon's name. I looked up at Meredith. She gave me a sharp nod, pointing her pen at the screen. "Answer it," she commanded. I swiped to accept the call, placed the phone on the glass coffee table, and hit record on my tablet. Brandon's voice echoed through the quiet hotel room. He didn't sound a bit like the heartbroken or worried brother his wife had just portrayed online. He sounded exactly like a cheap extortionist trying to bully a vulnerable target. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," Brandon sneered. "Dad is furious. He says if you wire $10,000 right now for breaking the guest house lease agreement, they won't pursue legal action for property damage. Don't think you can just run away from your financial obligations." I leaned back against the hotel sofa, crossing my arms. "Property damage?" I repeated, keeping my voice absolutely flat and devoid of emotion. "Don't play dumb," Brandon snapped. "You left the guest house a total mess. I have to hire an emergency cleaning crew and a contractor to fix the walls before I can move my startup headquarters in. Have that 10 grand transferred by tomorrow morning or we're dragging you to court. Don't test us, Sydney. You're just a gardener. You don't have the money or the brains to fight a real legal battle." I let his arrogant words hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. I looked over at Meredith, who was sporting a dangerous smile. Leaning forward, I brought my face close to the phone's microphone. "Do you know what the legal consequences are for fraud in this state, Brandon?" I asked quietly. Dead silence fell over the other end of the line. "Do you know what the federal penalties are for forging a signature on a $500,000 home equity loan application?" I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Because the credit union's fraud department knows exactly what they are." I heard Brandon catch his breath. His arrogant bravado instantly vanished. How do you," he stammered, his voice suddenly sounding incredibly small. "How do you know about the loan?" "Enjoy the turkey, Brandon," I said, ignoring his panic. "Eat every single bite, because that is the very last meal you and your fake investors will ever eat in that house." I reached out and ended the call, cutting off whatever frantic excuse he was about to make. I tossed the phone back onto the table and looked across the room at my lawyer. Meredith was already pulling a fresh stack of legal documents from her briefcase, her pen hovering over the signature line. "Start the eviction," I told her. "Let's go take my house back." Exactly 7 days after Thanksgiving, the backyard guest house was glowing with rented string lights, radiating the sheer arrogance of stolen wealth. I stood at the edge of the driveway, watching valet drivers park a line of luxury European sedans onto the pristine gravel, the very driveway I had maintained with my own hands for the past 5 years. Brandon and Monique were throwing a combined housewarming and startup launch party. Through the massive glass doors of the guest house, I could see catering staff in crisp white shirts handing flutes of champagne to a crowd dressed in designer evening wear. Brandon stood by the stone fireplace in a custom velvet blazer, gesturing wildly as he pitched his tech app to a group of older, wealthy men. Monique floated through the crowd in a floor-length sequin gown, playing the part of the dutiful executive wife. They had completely rearranged my former living space, filling it with rented modern art and leather couches to project an image of absolute success. They thought I was hiding out in some cheap motel, crying over the vicious social media smear campaign they had launched against me. They thought I was still the girl in dirt-stained overalls who would always bow her head and take their mistreatment in silence. Tonight I was not that girl. I was wearing a perfectly tailored, sharp charcoal power suit with black stilettos, carrying a leather briefcase packed with documents that were about to shatter their entire reality. I had absolutely zero patience left for their delusions. I walked past the valet stand and stepped through the double doors of the guest house. The jazz music was loud, but my entrance did not go unnoticed. Monique spotted me first. Her fake, polite hostess smile instantly dropped, replaced by a deep look of pure disgust. She marched across the room, her voice cutting over the music, intentionally loud enough for the nearest group of potential investors to hear. "Oh, look everyone," Monique announced, waving her champagne glass in my direction. The homeless gardener crawled back. "I guess you saw the catering trucks and figured you'd grab some free food and champagne before heading back to whatever shelter you're sleeping in." A few of the guests chuckled awkwardly. Brandon turned around, his face flushing bright red. He quickly excused himself from the older men he was pitching to and stormed over to us. He grabbed my arm, trying to drag me toward the door, but I planted my feet, standing as solid as a stone pillar. "You have some nerve showing up here, Sydney," he hissed, trying to keep his voice down so his guests wouldn't hear the panic vibrating in his chest. "I told you on the phone, if you didn't wire that 10 grand, we were taking you to court. Get off my property right now before I have security throw you out. You're ruining my funding pitch." I didn't even blink. I didn't raise my voice. I pulled my arm out of his grip and simply looked at the man standing directly behind Brandon. It was Marcus Vance, a prominent venture capitalist known for being absolutely ruthless in the boardroom and for owning a flawless, sprawling estate in the Hamptons. He was exactly the kind of big investor Brandon was desperately trying to catch to fund his fake lifestyle. I stepped neatly around my brother and extended my hand to the older gentleman. "Marcus, it's wonderful to see you outside of the city," I said smoothly. Marcus Vance's stern, evaluating face immediately broke into a wide, genuine smile. He shook my hand warmly, pulling me in for a brief, friendly embrace. "Sydney, what a fantastic surprise. I had no idea you ran in these suburban circles. I thought you were too busy preparing the botanical designs for my new Hamptons property to attend a local launch party." Brandon stared at us, his jaw dropping. Monique looked like she had just been slapped across the face. Her smug expression melted into absolute confusion. "You two know each other?" Brandon stammered, his eyes darting frantically between me and the billionaire investor. Marcus chuckled, patting my shoulder respectfully. "Know her? Sydney is the CEO of the most exclusive botanical design firm on the East Coast. I just signed a $2 million contract with her company last week to redesign my entire estate. She is an absolute genius when it comes to landscape architecture and ecological design. I trust her judgment implicitly." I turned my attention back to my brother and sister-in-law, letting a slow, incredibly sharp smile spread across my lips. "I'm not here for free champagne, Monique. I'm here because Marcus asked me to evaluate the soil quality and conservatory potential of this property before he committed any capital to this alleged startup." I paused, letting the silence stretch across the room as the jazz band conveniently finished their set. The entire party went dead quiet. Every single guest was staring directly at us, hanging on to my every word. "But honestly, Marcus, I would hold off on writing my brother any checks," I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the guest house. "What do you mean by that?" Marcus asked, his warm smile fading into a sharp, analytical gaze directed at Brandon. I looked straight into Brandon's terrified, wide eyes. "I mean, his entire life is an empty shell. He has absolutely no assets, no business plan, and no capital. Oh, and Brandon, the luxury rental company accidentally called my cell phone this afternoon since my name is still tied to this address. That rental Porsche you parked in the driveway is due back by 8 o'clock tonight, and the credit card you left on file was just declined for the extension fee." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy guests, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Investors began whispering, stepping backward and away from Brandon as if he had suddenly become contagious. Monique's grip loosened completely, and her champagne glass slipped from her hand. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending expensive liquid pooling around her designer heels, perfectly mirroring the complete destruction of their fake empire. For 5 agonizing seconds, the sound of dripping champagne was the only noise in the guest house. Marcus Vance looked at Brandon with absolute disgust, shook his head, and walked straight out the door. The other investors immediately followed suit, murmuring among themselves as they grabbed their coats and fled the sinking ship. Brandon looked like he was about to be sick. He stood frozen, staring at the stain spreading across the expensive rug. But my father Richard had a completely different reaction. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He shoved his way past the remaining guests, his expensive loafers heavy against the hardwood floor. "How dare you humiliate this family?" Richard roared, his voice shaking the exposed brick walls. "You ungrateful, malicious failure! I told you this morning to get off my property." He reached into his tailored slacks, pulled out his phone, and aggressively dialed 3 digits. I stood my ground, my hands resting lightly on the leather handle of my briefcase. I watched him press the phone to his ear, his chest heaving with false outrage. "Yes, I need the authorities at this address immediately," Richard yelled into the receiver. "I have a hostile trespasser who refuses to leave my property. She is harassing my guests and threatening my family. Send a unit to the Wilson estate right now." He slammed the phone shut, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You've gone too far this time, Sydney. I'm pressing charges. You're spending the holiday weekend in a cell, and I will personally make sure the judge gives you the maximum sentence." My mother, Patricia, immediately jumped into action. Seeing the few remaining guests watching the drama unfold, she clapped a hand over her mouth, letting out a dramatic, trembling sob. She sank heavily onto a rented leather sofa, playing the part of a fragile, terrified matriarch perfectly. "Why is she doing this to us?" Patricia wailed, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. "We gave her everything. We gave her a place to live, and she tries to ruin her brother out of pure jealousy. Someone please get her away from us." Monique, desperate to recover from her public humiliation, rushed over to Patricia's side. She snatched a fresh glass of champagne from a terrified caterer frozen against the wall, taking a massive gulp to steady her nerves. She wrapped her free arm around my mother, glaring at me with a look of venomous triumph. "You're finished, Sydney," Monique sneered. "The police are going to drag you out of here in handcuffs." I didn't say a single word. I didn't need to. I simply walked over to the sleek, modern bar Brandon had set up, pulled out a stool, and sat down. Placing my leather briefcase on the counter, I waited quietly. 10 minutes later, the heavy sound of car doors slamming echoed from the driveway. Red and blue police lights flashed violently through the massive glass windows of the guest house, painting the snow-covered lawn in harsh colors. 2 patrol cars had pulled right up to the entrance. 3 officers marched through the double doors, their hands resting alertly on their utility belts. Leading them was a tall, imposing sergeant with graying hair and a stern expression who scanned the room. "Who called for assistance?" the sergeant asked, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Richard rushed forward, gesturing wildly toward me. "I did, officer. That woman is my daughter, but she has completely lost her mind. She was evicted this morning, and now she's trespassing, harassing my son, and causing a massive disturbance. I want her handcuffed and removed immediately." Patricia let out another loud, theatrical sob, burying her face into Monique's shoulder. "She's terrifying us, officer," Patricia cried. "She's completely unstable. We don't feel safe in our own home." The sergeant nodded gravely, taking in the scene. He walked over to the bar where I was sitting. He looked me up and down, noting my calm demeanor and tailored suit, which contrasted sharply with the image of the hysterical woman my parents had just painted. "Ma'am," the sergeant said, his tone firm but professional. "The property owners have requested that you leave. I need you to stand up, gather your belongings, and exit the premises immediately. If you refuse, I will have to place you under arrest for trespassing." I looked at the sergeant, maintaining direct eye contact. "I understand you're just doing your job, officer," I replied smoothly, "but there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding about who actually owns this property." Richard scoffed loudly, crossing his arms. "Don't listen to her delusions. I am Richard Wilson. This is my estate. Arrest her." I unclasped the brass locks on my briefcase. The sharp click sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. Reaching inside, I pulled out 2 thick stacks of documents, printed on heavy cardstock and stamped with the official blue seals of the county clerk and the local court. I slid the first stack across the bar toward the sergeant. "This is the certified trust deed for the entire $4 million estate," I stated clearly, making sure my voice carried to the back of the room. "It legally lists me, Sydney Wilson, as the sole and exclusive owner." The sergeant frowned, picking up the paperwork. His eyes scanned the official county seal and the highlighted beneficiary information. I pushed the second stack forward. "And this," I continued, my voice dripping with absolute authority, "is an emergency vacation order signed by a superior court judge just 2 hours ago. My parents were granted a conditional life estate by my late grandmother, but as of this morning, they have completely invalidated that right by illegally attempting to evict me and committing felony fraud to borrow money against my property." The sergeant read the judge's signature, his expression turning grim as he processed the undeniable legal evidence in his hands. The tension in the guest house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Brandon had backed into a corner. Patricia stopped her fake crying entirely, her mouth hanging open in silent horror. Richard's arrogant posture evaporated, his arms dropping limply to his sides. The sergeant slowly placed the documents back on the bar. Turning his back to me, he faced my parents, his expression shifting from professional patience to absolute authority. "Sir," the sergeant said, his voice cold and echoing through the room, "this young lady is the legal owner of this estate. Your life tenancy has been terminated due to a breach of trust. You, your son, and his wife have exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises, or I will return to arrest you all for trespassing." Monique's hand began to shake violently. The freshly poured champagne glass slipped through her trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered. The sound of breaking crystal broke the last spell holding the room together. The remaining investors didn't wait for any explanations. They practically trampled each other, rushing to the coat closet. Brandon lunged forward, frantically grabbing the arm of a tech executive, wildly promising that it was all a huge misunderstanding and that the funding round was still open. The executive shook him off with a look of pure disgust and hurried out the double doors. Outside, the gravel driveway became a chaotic chorus of slamming doors and roaring engines as valet drivers scrambled to return the luxury vehicles. The flashing red and blue lights of the patrol cars illuminated the mass exodus, casting long shadows across the walls of the guest house. The sergeant remained unmoved by the ensuing panic. His harsh gaze stayed locked onto my father. 72 hours, the sergeant repeated, his voice carrying the full weight of the law. "I highly suggest you start packing tonight. If my deputies have to return to this property on Thursday, we won't be knocking nicely." My father opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer crushing reality of the certified court documents on the bar finally shut him up. He looked at the armed officers, looked at the empty room, and finally looked at me. The absolute hatred in his eyes was almost overwhelming, but he was completely powerless. He roughly grabbed my mother's arm, pulling her toward the exit. Brandon and Monique followed closely behind, their heads bowed as they walked past the police officers and out into the freezing November night. The weekend was a frantic, humiliating blur for my family. Under the watchful eye of a private security firm I hired using my own funds, they were forced to pack up the massive estate they had falsely claimed as their own. I watched from the security monitors as Patricia shed actual tears, shoving her designer shoes and silk clothing into heavy cardboard boxes. Richard paced the hardwood floors of the master bedroom, barking orders at Brandon, who was struggling to carry a massive flat-screen television down the grand staircase. By Sunday evening, the tension inside the main house had reached a boiling point. I was reviewing the security footage from my hotel room when I heard my father's voice. He was standing in the foyer, surrounded by a mountain of luggage, pouring himself a heavy glass of scotch. Patricia was sitting on a taped-up moving box, her hands over her face. "Stop crying, Patricia," Richard snapped, taking a massive gulp of his drink. "Let Sydney have her little moment of victory. She thinks she won, but she's naive." Patricia looked up, her mascara smeared across her face. "We are being kicked out onto the street, Richard. How can you be so calm?" Richard smiled, a cold, calculating look that made my skin crawl. "Don't worry about it. That $500,000 home equity loan hits Monday morning. The second that cash enters our joint account, we are invincible. We will hire the best lawyers in this state and bury her in endless litigation. By the time I'm done draining her in court, she'll be begging us to take the house back." By Monday morning, the harsh reality of their situation had fully set in. With Brandon's credit cards completely maxed out and my parents' liquid assets tied up in bad investments, they were forced to check into a cheap roadside motel on the edge of the city. The contrast was staggering. The cramped room smelled of stale smoke and industrial bleach. The floral bedspreads were worn thin, and the flashing neon sign outside cast a sickly green glow across the stained carpet. Richard sat at a shaky laminate desk in the corner of the room, typing furiously on his laptop. He had the banking portal open, clicking the refresh button over and over. He was waiting for the $500,000 deposit to appear. Clicking on the transfer tab, he entered the routing number for an offshore legal retainer account and hit submit. The screen instantly froze. A bright red warning banner flashed across the monitor. Access denied, account frozen. Richard swore loudly, slamming his fist onto the desk. He grabbed his phone and angrily dialed the direct line to the credit union. Mr. Thorne answered on the second ring, his voice completely stripped of his usual polite customer service tone. "Listen to me, Thorne," Richard roared, skipping any pleasantries. "Your system is glitching, my account is locked, and the home equity funds haven't cleared. I need you to manually override the transfer block right now." Mr. Thorne let out a heavy sigh that came through the phone's speaker clear as day. "There is no glitch, Richard. I personally froze your accounts at dawn." "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, the color beginning to drain from his face. "You don't have the authority to freeze my money." "I have the authority to halt a fraudulent transaction," Mr. Thorne replied coldly. "Your daughter sat in my office on Thanksgiving morning. We reviewed the loan application together. She confirmed that the signature in the guarantor box was entirely forged. I have officially reported the fraudulent application to our internal fraud division, and per federal banking regulations, I have notified the authorities. You aren't getting a single dime." The phone slipped from Richard's sweaty palm, clattering heavily onto the cheap motel desk. He sat there frozen, staring blankly at the red error message on his laptop screen as the reality of his absolute ruin washed over him. He was broke, homeless, and facing imminent legal consequences. A sharp gasp from the doorway shattered the silence. Monique was standing on the threshold of the adjoining motel room, holding a plastic bucket filled with cheap ice. She had heard every single word coming through the phone's speaker. The defensive shell of denial she had been clinging to all weekend instantly evaporated. Her grip loosened and the bucket hit the floor with a heavy thud, scattering ice cubes across the stained carpet. She marched down the narrow, dimly lit motel hallway, her designer heels clicking angrily against the cheap linoleum. She slammed her fist against Brandon's door until he pulled it open, looking disheveled and exhausted. Monique didn't hesitate. She shoved her way inside, backing Brandon into a corner. "What do you mean the funds are frozen?" Monique screamed, her voice completely hysterical. "You told me you owned that house. You told me your startup was fully funded. You promised me we were going to be rich." Brandon raised his hands, his eyes darting nervously toward the hallway as other motel guests began cracking their doors to watch the drama unfold. "Monique, keep it down. We're just having a temporary cash flow issue. Dad is handling it." "Handling it?" Monique shrieked, losing all control. "Your father just committed felony bank fraud. You're a broke, pathetic fraud who does nothing but drain your sister. I married a fake millionaire." Patricia rushed out of her room, trying to quiet her daughter-in-law down, but Monique turned her venomous rage right toward her. Having lost the victim they had spent years targeting, these bitter accomplices had no choice but to turn on each other like a pack of starving wolves. I sat in my luxurious, quiet hotel suite downtown, miles away from the cheap roadside motel where my family was currently tearing each other apart. The fallout from the frozen bank accounts was entirely predictable. Without my father's money to shelter them, their toxic loyalty dissolved in an instant. My phone vibrated on the glass coffee table, breaking the silence of the room. It was a text message from Richard. I opened it, expecting a pathetic plea for money or another empty legal threat. Instead, it was a bitter, desperate promise of destruction. "If you don't drop the eviction and give us back the house, I guarantee you won't have a house left to take." I stared at the glowing screen. Most people would have dismissed it as an empty threat born out of bruised pride, but I knew my father too well. I knew that beneath his tailored suits and country club smile simmered a destructive, vindictive rage. When Richard Wilson didn't get his way, he ruined things. Growing up, he smashed a prize-winning science project of mine simply because I interrupted his golf game to show him. When he was angry over a business deal, he intentionally backed his luxury car over my bicycle. During arguments, he would shatter my mother's heirloom china just to watch her flinch. He would absolutely rather destroy that $4 million estate than watch me legally possess it. I didn't reply. A response was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to know he had gotten under my skin. He wanted to feel like he still held some shred of control over my emotions. Instead of typing a reply, I made a phone call. On Tuesday afternoon, while my family was still arguing with motel management over declined credit cards, a discreet high-end private security team arrived at the estate. I paid a massive rush fee to ensure absolute confidentiality and rapid deployment. Over the next 6 hours, a team of technicians wired the entire property. They installed miniature high-definition cameras within the ornate crown molding of the main house, tucked them into the vaulted ceilings of the guest house, and concealed them around the exterior entrances. More importantly, they integrated a state-of-the-art smart home audio system, connecting the property's intercoms directly to an encrypted app on my phone. I specifically instructed the lead technician to focus the primary camera angles on the grand foyer and the main living room. That was where Grandmother Josephine's antique stained glass windows were installed. They were massive, custom pieces of art from the 1920s depicting intricate botanical scenes, refracting the morning sun into a breathtaking kaleidoscope of colors. They were priceless. Because my father had let the insurance policies lapse to pay for the lease on Brandon's sports car, they were completely uninsured, and they were the structural and historical soul of the house. If Richard wanted to cause maximum emotional and financial damage, he would go straight for that glass. Tuesday night bled into the early hours of Wednesday morning. I sat in my dark hotel room, the cool light of my tablet illuminating my face. The surveillance matrix showed the empty, quiet rooms of the estate. My family was supposed to have vacated completely, and the property was legally locked down. But I knew Richard's ego would never allow him to slip away quietly. He had to leave a scar. At exactly 2 a.m, a sharp digital notification chimed through the quiet hotel room. Motion detected at the rear patio entrance. I bolted upright, immediately expanding the camera feed on my tablet screen. The night vision display activated, rendering the scene in stark black and white detail. A figure in a heavy dark coat, with a baseball cap pulled low, was picking the lock on the back door. The lock, which he had clearly tampered with before moving out, gave way with very little effort. It was Richard. He stepped into the mudroom, his heavy boots tracking dirt and melting snow across the pristine vintage tile. He hadn't come with duffel bags to steal leftover valuables. In his right hand, he held a heavy steel sledgehammer. The metal head caught the faint light filtering through the windows. With heavy, deliberate steps, he bypassed the renovated kitchen and marched down the hallway toward the main living area. His target was exactly what I had anticipated: the stained glass windows. He stopped dead in the center of the expansive living room. The moonlight streamed through the antique panels, casting a faint mottled pattern across his face. Even through the surveillance feed, I could see his features twisted into a mask of pure, bitter malice. He adjusted his grip on the handle, his shoulders rolling back as he prepared to swing the heavy steel head directly into the center panel of the century-old glass. He wanted to shatter my grandmother's legacy, reducing the history of the house to jagged shards on the floor, simply to punish me for outsmarting him. My finger hovered over the emergency dial button on the security app, which would instantly connect me to the local police dispatch. A break-in combined with aggravated property damage was an absolute guarantee of a felony conviction. The police would arrive in minutes, but simply having him arrested in silence didn't feel like enough. That was too easy. I wanted him to know deep in his bones that his reign of terror was completely over. I wanted him to understand that I was watching his every move, anticipating his every failure, and completely controlling the environment he thought he commanded. I bypassed the police button and tapped the microphone icon connected to the estate's hidden intercom system. I took a slow, deep breath, staring at the screen as he raised the sledgehammer, and let my voice drop to a cold, razor-sharp whisper that would echo through the hidden high-definition speakers concealed in the ceiling above him. Felony property damage over $10,000 carries a minimum sentence of 5 years, Dad. My voice boomed through the hidden surround sound speakers, echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the main house in crystal-clear audio. Add that to the forgery charges for the home equity loan, and you'll ruin your life in a federal facility. Richard froze mid-swing. The heavy steel sledgehammer slipped from his leather-gloved, trembling hands. It hit the hardwood floor with a deafening, sickening thud, narrowly missing his expensive boots. He spun around wildly, his eyes darting toward the ceiling, searching the shadows for the source of my voice. His chest heaved with panicked, ragged breaths as the realization of where he was hit him. He was trapped in a web of high-definition surveillance of his own making. "Who's there?" Richard stammered, backing away from the antique stained glass panels as if they had suddenly become radioactive. "Where are you hiding?" "I'm sitting comfortably in my hotel suite," I replied smoothly, watching him sweat on my tablet screen. "Every square inch of this estate is wired, Dad. I watched you pick the lock on the mudroom door. I've already recorded the entire thing and uploaded it to a secure cloud server. Did you really think I would leave a $4 million property completely undefended against a man who used to smash my science fairs just to win an argument?" Outside, the sharp crunch of tires over gravel cut through the silence. Patricia had grown tired of waiting in the idling rental car. The heavy oak front door was pushed open, and my mother rushed into the foyer, her designer coat wrapped tightly around her shivering frame. She hurried down the hallway, her heels clicking rapidly, until she found Richard standing frozen in the center of the living room. "Richard, what is taking so long?" Patricia hissed, her voice tight with nervous agitation. "Break the damn window so we can get out of here before the neighbors wake up." "Look up, Mom," I said through the intercom, turning the volume to maximum. Patricia let out a sharp shriek, stumbling backward into a side table. A decorative vase wobbled dangerously before settling. She gripped Richard's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his heavy winter coat, as her eyes darted frantically toward the ceiling speakers. "Sydney?" Patricia gasped, her voice trembling. You're watching us?" "In ultra-high definition," I confirmed coldly, "and so is the private security company monitoring the feed. You've crossed state lines into a major felony by breaking into a secured property with a deadly weapon." Panic instantly hijacked my mother's nervous system. The arrogant, dismissive woman who had spent 30 years belittling my existence vanished, replaced by a terrified, desperate, cornered animal. She spotted the main house landline resting on the console table. Lunging for it, she ripped the receiver from its cradle and dialed my cell phone number from memory. My personal phone vibrated on the hotel nightstand. I answered it, putting it on speaker so she could hear her own voice echoing back through the estate. "Sydney, please!" Patricia wailed into the receiver, her voice thick with practiced hysteria. "You can't do this to us. We made a mistake. Your father was just upset. He didn't mean to actually break anything. You have to delete that footage. I'm your mother. I gave birth to you. How can you be so cold?" I watched her on the surveillance matrix. She was dropping to her knees on the hardwood floor, weeping loudly, playing the ultimate victim card. It was the exact same routine she had pulled her entire life every time a lie caught up with her. She expected me to fold. She expected the dutiful daughter to rush in, dry her tears, and absorb all the collateral damage. "You threw me into a blizzard on Thanksgiving night, Mom," I said, my voice empty of emotion. "You watched Richard lock the door while I stood on the freezing porch in a light coat. You and Brandon laughed about how I deserved to be homeless. My warmth ran out a long time ago." "We were just trying to teach you respect," Patricia sobbed, clutching the phone receiver like a lifeline. "We're a family. Families are supposed to protect each other." "Families don't commit bank fraud using my signature," I shot back. "Families don't try to steal a $4 million estate to fund a fake tech startup. You aren't my family. You're just a group of people who happened to share my last name until I finally recognized my own worth." Richard ripped the phone from Patricia's hand, his face turning a deep, mottled purple with sheer terror. "Sydney, listen to me. I'll pay it back. I'll get the money. Tell the security company to drop the alert. Don't involve the authorities. It will ruin my reputation. I'll lose my country club membership. I'll lose everything." "You already lost everything, Dad," I stated, staring at his desperate face on the monitor. "The moment you decided your ego was worth more than your daughter, and as for the authorities, I didn't need to involve them." Through the live audio feed, I heard the unmistakable heavy crunch of thick tires tearing up the gravel driveway. A second later, an aggressive, sweeping pulse of red and blue emergency strobes cut through the darkness outside. The harsh strobe colors illuminated the antique stained glass, casting fractured, chaotic rainbows across my parents' terrified faces. "The silent alarm triggered the second you picked the lock on the mudroom," I told them, watching two marked patrol cars screech to a halt in front of the estate. "The police are already in the driveway. Have fun booking your stay." I ended the call, cutting off the intercom feed, and leaned back in my chair. On the muted video feed, I watched as 4 armed police officers kicked open the front door, their flashlight beams cutting through the dark hallways until they landed squarely on Richard and Patricia. Richard slowly raised his hands above his head, the sledgehammer lying uselessly at his feet. My mother collapsed completely, burying her face into the expensive rug she would never step foot on again. The heavy metal click of handcuffs echoed sharply through the vaulted ceilings of the living room. The lead officer pushed Richard against the antique mahogany console table, reading him his rights in a practiced, bored tone. Richard stammered in protest, his face pressed uncomfortably against the polished wood, demanding to call the mayor, the police chief, or anyone who would listen to his deflated ego. The officers ignored him completely, marching him out into the freezing night and into the back of a waiting cruiser. Patricia followed right behind, screaming hysterically as her expensive silk robe dragged through the mud and melting snow of the driveway. I watched the entire pathetic show from the high-definition feed in my hotel room, my face completely expressionless as the police cars drove away. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in financial desperation for my parents. Richard was denied bail due to the combination of the forged loan application and the felony vandalism charge. Patricia was left to scramble entirely on her own. Brandon and Monique had vanished completely, fleeing to a friend's couch in another state to avoid the fallout. Left entirely alone, Patricia had to liquidate their last remaining untouched retirement accounts. Every single dollar they had saved for their old age was drained just to cover Richard's massive bail requirement and retain a defense attorney. And they didn't just hire any lawyer. They scraped together enough cash to retain Marcus Sterling, a notoriously aggressive and slimy trial attorney, known for dragging families through the mud to secure massive settlements. Richard's fragile ego couldn't accept defeat. Instead of taking a graceful exit, he decided to double down. They filed a massive civil lawsuit against me, challenging the validity of the property deed and the trust itself. Their primary argument was entirely predictable and deeply insulting. They claimed that grandmother Josephine had been suffering from severe dementia in her final years, and that I had maliciously manipulated an elderly, confused woman to strip her only son of his rightful inheritance. 3 weeks later, the cold conference room in downtown Boston smelled of stale coffee and cheap leather. I sat at a long mahogany table, dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit. Sitting next to me was my attorney, Meredith, a brilliant, sharp-eyed woman who radiated a quiet, lethal confidence. Across the table, Richard and Patricia glared at me with absolute venom. Patricia looked entirely haggard, the gray roots of her hair showing, her designer clothes hanging loosely from her shrinking frame. Richard was sweating profusely, tapping his pen against the table in a rapid, agitated rhythm. Sterling paced the room, performing for the court reporter in the corner. He immediately launched into a vicious, unprovoked attack on my character. He pulled up my past medical records, highlighting a brief period of depression I had experienced in my 20s following a severe car accident. He twisted the facts, aggressively painting me as an unstable, financially desperate predator who was entirely capable of elder abuse. He claimed I was a struggling gardener who saw an easy target in a fading, confused grandmother. "You isolated Josephine," Sterling roared, leaning over the table, his finger pointing directly at my face. "You exploited her declining mental state. You tricked a confused elderly woman into stripping her loving son of his rightful inheritance just so you could play millionaire. This is a textbook case of manipulation, and we are going to see you stripped of every single asset you stole." I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at Meredith. She offered a slow, predatory smile. Calmly reaching into her sleek leather briefcase, she pulled out something completely unexpected. It wasn't a medical record or a character reference. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger. The pages were yellowed with age, and the cover was worn from years of handling. She placed it gently in the center of the table. The dull thud cut Sterling off mid-sentence. "I think you fundamentally misunderstand the timeline of Josephine's mental acuity," Meredith said, her voice smooth as glass. "This is Josephine's private journal and meticulous financial ledger. It covers the last 15 years of her life. She was an incredibly brilliant woman who accounted for every single dollar she earned." Meredith opened the ledger to a bookmarked page and slid it across the polished wood, directly in front of Sterling and Richard. "If you look at the entries from exactly 10 years ago, Meredith continued, locking her gaze onto my father, You will see a detailed day-by-day accounting of how Richard systematically drained exactly $200,000 from her business accounts. She documented every forged check, every unauthorized withdrawal, and every single lie he told when she confronted him. The color instantly drained from Sterling's face. His aggressive posture melted into pure panic as his eyes scanned the undeniable proof written in my grandmother's precise, elegant handwriting. Richard let out a ragged gasp, his hands shaking violently as the ghosts of his past sins stared back at him. Patricia let out a strangled wheeze, clapping her hands over her mouth as the elaborate lie they had built their entire lawsuit upon dissolved in a matter of seconds. "This is exactly why she established the blind trust," Meredith stated, her voice carrying an absolute sense of finality. "She didn't have dementia. She was protecting her granddaughter and her life's work from a thief." The heavy, polished oak doors of the county civil court slammed shut, sealing us inside a room that felt as cold and sterile as a hospital wing. This was the final battlefield. This hearing was designed to finalize the eviction, clear the title to the historic estate, and officially remove the absurd property encumbrances my father had tried to slap onto it. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my posture rigid, dressed in a custom charcoal suit with my attorney, Meredith, by my side. Across the aisle, Richard and Patricia had orchestrated a dramatic wardrobe transformation. The impeccably tailored Italian suits, the country club signet rings, and the designer silk shirts were gone. In their place, they had dressed down to look like destitute, vulnerable victims. Patricia wore a faded, oversized beige cardigan that she intentionally slouched her shoulders into, her makeup deliberately light to emphasize the dark circles under her eyes. Richard wore a wrinkled corduroy jacket, clutching a cane he had never needed before, his hands resting on the curved wooden handle with a practiced tremble. They were putting on the performance of their lives, playing the part of desperate, elderly parents abandoned by a ruthless, greedy daughter. Sitting in the second row of the gallery, Brandon and Monique completely ruined their parents' poverty aesthetic. Brandon wore an obnoxious luxury watch that caught the overhead fluorescent lights as he glared at the back of my head. Monique sat next to him, aggressively scrolling through her phone, looking deeply annoyed that she had to be awake before noon. As the proceedings began, my parents' attorney, the aggressive and notorious Marcus Sterling, immediately launched into his sob story. He stood before the judge, a stern, sharp-eyed woman named the Honorable Judge Davis, and painted a tragic picture. He claimed my parents were vulnerable and broke, having poured their life savings into raising me, only to be thrown out into the freezing streets over a simple family misunderstanding. When I was called to the stand, Sterling didn't hold back. He paced the floor like a cornered predator, viciously attacking my character. He brought up my past medical records again, twisting a brief period of professional burnout I had experienced in my 20s, desperate to paint me as emotionally unstable and financially desperate. "You isolated Josephine," Sterling roared, his thick finger pointing directly at my face as I sat in the witness box. "You exploited her declining mental state. You tricked a confused elderly woman into stripping her loving son of his rightful inheritance, just so you could act like a wealthy real estate mogul. You are emotionally unstable, you are vindictive, and this trust is entirely the product of elder abuse." I didn't blink, I didn't raise my voice, I just looked at Meredith. She stood up smoothly, smoothing the front of her blazer with a cool, predatory smile. "Your Honor, the defense is attempting to construct a narrative of manipulation based on the false premise that Josephine Wilson suffered from cognitive decline. We ask to introduce Plaintiff's Exhibit A to clarify this fundamental misunderstanding." Meredith walked over to the center table and reached into her sleek leather briefcase. She pulled out the thick, leather-bound ledger. Its pages were yellowed with age, and the cover was worn from years of handling. She slid the ledger across the polished wood directly toward Sterling. "This is Josephine's private journal and meticulous financial ledger," Meredith stated, her voice carrying absolute clarity. "It covers the last 15 years of her life. She was an incredibly brilliant woman who accounted for every single dollar she earned. If you turn to the tabbed entries from 10 years ago, you will see a detailed day-by-day accounting of how Richard systematically drained exactly $200,000 from her business accounts." The color instantly drained from Sterling's face. His aggressive posture melted into pure panic as his eyes scanned the undeniable proof written in my grandmother's precise, elegant handwriting. She documented every forged check, every unauthorized withdrawal, and every single lie he told when she confronted him. Meredith continued, turning her gaze toward my father. This is exactly why she established the blind trust. She didn't have dementia. She was protecting her granddaughter and her life's work from a thief. Richard let out a ragged gasp, his hands shaking violently, without the fake tremble this time. Patricia let out a strangled wheeze, her hands clapping tightly over her mouth as the elaborate lie they had built their entire lawsuit upon dissolved in a matter of seconds. But I wasn't finished. The ledger established the foundation of their deception, but I wanted the court to see exactly who these people were today. Your Honor, Meredith continued, her pace unbothered. The defense claims that my client ruthlessly cast vulnerable, loving parents out into the cold. We ask permission to submit 2 digital audio files into evidence to demonstrate the true nature of this family dynamic. Judge Davis, who was now glaring at Richard with thinly veiled contempt, nodded her approval. Meredith connected her laptop to the courtroom's audio system. She clicked play on the first file. Brandon's voice echoed through the courtroom, dripping with arrogant entitlement. The recording of his extortion call was crystal clear. The judge listened intently as my brother demanded $30,000 as a condition for vacating the guest house quietly, threatening to rip the copper piping from the walls and ruin the historic structure if I refused to pay the ransom. A heavy, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the gallery. I watched Brandon shrink lower into the wooden bench, pulling the collar of his expensive coat tight around his neck to hide his flushing face. Monique stopped scrolling on her phone, her eyes darting nervously toward the heavy oak exit doors. Then, Meredith clicked on the second file. It was the surveillance audio from Thanksgiving night. The sound of a howling winter wind filled the courtroom, followed by Patricia's sharp, mocking laughter. Then came Richard's cruel, commanding voice. Let her freeze. I don't care if she sleeps in the snow. Lock the door. The heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. The contrast was devastating. The fragile, frightened victims currently cowering at the defense table were completely exposed as the vicious, calculating abusers who had gleefully locked their own daughter out in a blizzard. The silence that followed the recordings was suffocating. Sterling stared at the floor, slowly sliding his legal pad back into his briefcase. He knew it was over. He was actively abandoning a sinking ship. Judge Davis leaned forward over her bench. Her expression had hardened into carved granite. She looked directly at Richard and Patricia with an expression of profound disgust. In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely witnessed such a toxic display of entitlement and pure, unadulterated performance, Judge Davis said, her voice cutting through the room with freezing authority. This court has absolute zero tolerance for the weaponization of the judicial system to perpetuate a pattern of domestic abuse. She reached for her gavel, gripping it tightly. Not only is the eviction finalized immediately, clearing the title fully into the plaintiff's name, but I am ordering you to repay the trust for the $30,000 you attempted to extort from your daughter. I will personally ensure a lien is placed against any of your future earnings until that debt is settled. Patricia gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. Richard's mouth hung wide open, his fake trembling completely forgotten. Judge Davis brought her gavel down with a deafening, resounding crack. Furthermore, she continued, her voice rising over Patricia's sudden, genuine tears, based on the overwhelming evidence presented here today, I am officially referring the forged home equity loan documents to the district attorney's office. This is no longer merely a civil dispute. Prepare yourselves for criminal prosecution. Court is adjourned. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a dull thud, dumping the miserable wreckage of my family out into the empty marble hallways of the civil courthouse. The air outside the courtroom felt thick with the weight of the judgment Judge Davis had just delivered. I walked out side by side with Meredith, my posture straight, the satisfying click of my heels echoing off the stone walls. For the first time in 30 years, I felt entirely weightless. The forgery case for the home equity loan had been handed over to the DA. The estate was permanently, legally mine, and a $30,000 extortion debt was officially wrapped around my parents' necks. Behind me, the chaotic footsteps of desperate people shattered the quiet. "Sydney!" It was a raspy, manic roar that bounced off the marble pillars. I stopped walking and slowly turned around. Brandon came bursting through the courtroom doors, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. He roughly shoved past a lingering court clerk, closing the distance between us with heavy, aggressive strides. His tailored suit looked like a cheap costume now, hanging off a panicked, cornered man. He stopped just inches from my face, looming over me, his chest heaving as he tried to use his size to force me into submission. It was the exact same bullying tactic he had used since we were teenagers, relying on intimidation to mask the complete emptiness inside him. "You ruined my life!" Brandon screamed, spit flying from his lips. He thrust a trembling finger directly toward my eyes. "Do you have any idea what you just did in there? My investors pulled out because of this mess. The media is going to get a hold of this lawsuit, and my entire company is going to go under, all because you wouldn't just share the estate like a normal person." I didn't step back. I didn't flinch. I simply looked up at him, studying the desperation and panic rolling through his eyes. He actually believed his own delusion. He had been told he was a genius for so long that he genuinely believed the collapse of his house of cards was my fault. "You never had any investors, Brandon," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, conversational volume that forced him to stop screaming just to hear me. He blinked, his hand freezing midair. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the illusion of your career," I continued, crossing my arms. "You don't have a VC-backed tech startup. You never did. You just had mom and dad stealing my money to fund your luxury lifestyle." "That's a lie," Brandon stammered, looking frantically around the hallway as if searching for an audience to validate him. "My company is valued at over $5 million. We were just finalizing a seed round." "Your seed round was funded entirely by an aging grandmother and a forged home equity loan," I corrected, stepping forward an inch, invading his space. "Meredith and I conducted a full forensic audit of your shell corporation last week while preparing for this hearing. Do you want to know what we found? We found zero legitimate revenue. We found zero viable product development. What we did find was a paper trail proving that the initial $200,000 you used to lease your downtown office and buy your sports car came directly from grandmother Josephine's accounts. It was the money Richard stole 10 years ago. He laundered it straight into your fake business to make you look like a prodigy." Brandon's jaw tightened, the crimson color draining from his face instantly. "And when that stolen money ran out," I pressed, my voice echoing clearly through the empty corridor, "because you blew it on luxury vacations and $1,000 dinners to impress your country club friends, mom and dad needed a new source of cash to keep your fake company afloat. That's why they forged my signature on the estate documents. They needed a $500,000 line of credit to keep playing the wealthy patrons to their golden boy. You aren't a CEO, Brandon. You're a 32-year-old parasite living off stolen allowances." "Shut up," Brandon hissed, his voice cracking. He glanced over his shoulder. Monique had just stepped out of the courtroom, catching the tail end of the entire conversation. She stood a few feet away, her hands gripping her designer handbag, her expression frozen in absolute horror. "Monique, don't listen to her," Brandon pleaded, his aggressive posture instantly collapsing into a pathetic whimper. He reached a hand out toward his wife. "She's just trying to get in my head. She's crazy. My lawyers will fix this." "Fix what, Brandon?" I asked, shifting my focus to Monique, letting the reality of the situation wash over her. "His parents are currently sitting in that room facing criminal fraud charges. They owe me $30,000 by court order. They are officially broke, and the district attorney is going to seize every asset tied to that fraudulent loan. That includes the corporate accounts used to fund your luxury lifestyle." Monique stared at Brandon. The mask of the bored, wealthy wife melted away, replaced by the sharp, terrifying realization of a woman who had just realized she had been conned. She looked at his expensive watch, his tailored suit, and the absolute panic oozing from his pores. "Is it true?" Monique demanded, her voice shaking with a suppressed, lethal anger. "The penthouse? The trips to Milan? The seed funding you bragged to my father about?" "Babe, I can explain," Brandon stammered, stepping toward her. "It's just a cash flow issue. Once this lawsuit clears, we'll be right back on top." Monique stepped directly between Brandon and me, effectively pushing him back. She looked at the man she had married with a mixture of pure, unadulterated disgust and absolute contempt. "You're broke," Monique stated, her voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. "You don't have a company. You don't have a trust fund. You're just a fraud living on stolen money." "Monique, please," Brandon begged, actual tears welling up in his eyes. She didn't say another word. With a swift, deliberate motion, Monique reached down to her left hand. She gripped the massive, sparkling diamond engagement ring and the matching wedding band, pulling them off her finger with a sharp yank. "Here," she sneered, slapping the heavy platinum bands directly against Brandon's chest. "You're going to need to pawn these to pay for your parents' bail." The rings bounced off his expensive blazer, hitting the marble floor with a sharp, metallic ring before spinning a few times and coming to a rest near his leather shoes. Without looking back, Monique turned on her heel. The rapid, sharp clicking of her stilettos echoed loudly through the courthouse hallway as she marched toward the exit, leaving the wreckage of her marriage on the floor. Brandon stood completely frozen, staring at the discarded rings at his feet. The arrogant, entitled golden boy who had tormented me for decades was completely gone. He looked up at me, his face pale, his eyes entirely hollow. He had no money, no company, no wife, and parents facing imminent imprisonment. I gave him one final look, feeling absolutely nothing inside. Adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder, I turned around and walked through the heavy glass doors into the bright, cold afternoon sun, leaving the golden boy entirely behind in the empty hallway. The silence that followed the courtroom showdown lasted for a solid 3 weeks. For me, it was a period of intense, focused rebuilding. I poured all of my energy into expanding my botanical design firm, securing a massive commercial contract to redesign the interior atrium of a new downtown tech campus. For Richard and Patricia, however, those 3 weeks were an accelerated descent into a legal and financial meat grinder. The district attorney didn't just review the forged home equity loan documents, he brought the full weight of the prosecutor's office down on them. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Richard and Patricia were officially arraigned on multiple felony charges. The indictment read like a masterclass in white-collar crime: forgery in the first degree, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, and attempted grand larceny. Their passports were confiscated, and their remaining assets, including the meager bank accounts they had tried to hide, were frozen by court order. The reality of mandatory state prison time finally shattered their wealthy delusions. They weren't high society elites playing real estate games anymore. They were common criminals facing a decade behind bars. When the storm finally broke the tranquility of my sanctuary, I was right in the middle of a client consultation. My studio was an airy, glass-walled loft filled with rare orchids, towering monstera plants, and custom terrariums, a space intentionally designed to be a peaceful oasis. Usually, the scent of damp soil and blooming jasmine kept the atmosphere completely serene. That peace was shattered when the heavy glass doors of the lobby were violently slammed open, crashing against the metal frame. I stepped out of my glass-walled office just in time to see Patricia aggressively shoving past my terrified receptionist. My mother looked like a completely different person. The woman who used to spend 3 hours at the salon every single day, always immaculately dressed, was gone. Her designer trench coat was rumpled and stained at the hem. Her hair was thrown into a messy, chaotic knot. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide and frantic, scanning the lush green studio like a trapped bird. "Sydney!" Patricia shrieked, her harsh voice echoing off the exposed brick walls. My employees froze. 2 high-profile corporate clients who had been flipping through a living wall portfolio turned around and stared in shock. I calmly walked into the lobby, gesturing for my security guard to stand by but stay in position. I stopped 5 feet away from the woman who had once locked me out in a blizzard, crossing my arms over my dark green silk shirt. "You are trespassing, Patricia," I stated, my voice low, steady, and devoid of any warmth. "You have exactly 30 seconds to leave my business, or my security guard will escort you out, and I will add a harassment charge to your growing list of legal troubles." Patricia completely ignored the warning. She lunged forward, gripping the edge of a custom mahogany display table so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You have to stop this, Sydney," she pleaded, her voice cracking into a desperate, gravelly sob. "You have to call the prosecutor right now. They took everything. The bank froze the accounts. Richard is talking about a plea deal that includes 5 years. 5 years. He won't survive in state prison, and I can't go to jail. I absolutely cannot do it." I stared at her, and where a daughter's emotion used to live, there was now nothing but deep, absolute emptiness. She wasn't apologizing for stealing my money. She wasn't apologizing for the past cruelty, the eviction, or the lies. She was crying simply because she had finally been caught, and the consequences were actively destroying her life. "You forged my signature on $1 million bank loan," I replied calmly, ensuring every single observer in the lobby could hear every word. "You tried to steal my inheritance to fund Brandon's fake company, and then you tried to extort $30,000 from me to leave a property you had absolutely no legal right to occupy. What exactly did you think was going to happen when a judge saw that evidence?" Patricia dropped directly to her knees on the polished concrete floor. It was a display so pathetic, so completely devoid of dignity, that several of my employees looked away out of pure second-hand embarrassment. "We'll do anything," she wailed, tears streaming down her face and pooling in the deep lines around her mouth. "Please, Sydney, I'm begging you. We'll work for you. We'll clean this studio. We'll spend the rest of our lives paying back every single cent. Just pick up the phone. Just call the district attorney and tell them this was all a huge misunderstanding. Tell them we just had a family dispute and you're dropping the charges." She reached out, trying to grab the hem of my pants. I deliberately took a step back, completely out of her reach. Her hands clutched empty air. "You still don't understand the gravity of the reality you are in," I said, looking down at her frantic, tear-streaked face. "You still think you can corner me in public to get out of a felony." Patricia froze, her tears instantly stopping as a flicker of desperate hope flashed in her eyes, assuming my hesitation meant I was actually considering her absurd proposal. "This is out of my hands now, Mom," I stated, my voice cutting through her manufactured hysteria like a blade. "Even if I wanted to drop the charges, I couldn't, and for the record, I absolutely do not want to." Patricia blinked, confusion crossing her features. "What do you mean you can't? You're the victim. You have to tell them to stop." "I am a witness," I corrected her coldly. "The victim in this specific criminal case is First National Bank. Because you defrauded a financially secured institution, the state took over the case entirely. You didn't just cross me, Patricia. You crossed the government. The DA is making an incredibly public, aggressive example out of you and Richard for white-collar property fraud. They are going to prosecute you to the absolute maximum extent of the law. And I am going to sit in the very front row and watch them do it." The last bit of color vanished from my mother's face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. "Security," I called out, never breaking eye contact with the woman on the floor. "Please escort this lady out of the building. If she resists, call the police and let them know an indicted felon out on bail is violating a trespassing warning." My security guard stepped forward, firmly gripping Patricia's arm and pulling her to her feet. She didn't fight back. She didn't scream. The crushing reality had finally broken through. Her charm, her tears, and her manipulation were completely useless against the weight of the justice system. She stumbled out through the glass doors, a broken, hollow shell disappearing into the crowded city streets. The morning air was crisp and unforgiving as 2 county sheriff cruisers parked at an angle across the estate's circular cobblestone driveway. The blue emergency lights flashed rhythmically, casting harsh shadows across the historic brick facade. This was the undeniable final reality of Judge Davis's ruling. The court had given Richard, Patricia, and Brandon exactly 72 hours to move out, but today was the official law enforcement supervised relocation. They were allowed back onto the property under police escort for exactly 4 hours to pack their personal belongings. The regulations were brutally clear. They could only take personal clothing, toiletries, and inexpensive non-luxury electronics. All the antique furniture, the Persian rugs, the grand piano, and the massive art collection belonged entirely to Josephine's blind trust. I stood on the wraparound porch with my arms crossed, flanked by an independent asset inventory auditor and a third police officer. We watched a battered, rust-colored U-Haul moving truck rumble down the oak-lined street and turn into the driveway. The sheer humiliation of the moment hung thick in the air. There were no sleek Mercedes, no imported sports cars. Richard cut the engine, and the 3 of them climbed down from the heavy cab of the commercial truck. Patricia looked physically ill. She stared up at the estate she had treated like her personal kingdom, her face pale. Brandon slammed the passenger door, slouching his shoulders against the morning chill, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The lead officer, a tall, serious man named Sergeant Miller, met them at the bottom of the steps. He handed Richard a roll of industrial black plastic trash bags. The vintage leather trunks and designer luggage sets were property purchased by the trust using stolen funds. They had to stuff their lives into trash bags. Over the next 3 hours, the grand historic house became a cold processing center. Officers followed them room to room, watching their every move with bored vigilance. I stayed downstairs, listening to the heavy footsteps echoing above. Patricia openly wept in the master suite when the auditor denied her request to take a velvet chaise lounge she claimed she bought herself. The auditor simply pointed to the corresponding receipt in the trust ledger and ordered her to move along. Richard packed in absolute hollow silence. He carried black plastic bags stuffed with slacks and sweaters down the grand staircase, his face entirely expressionless. He looked like a man who had finally realized he had run completely out of options. But the real spectacle was happening just past the property line. The flashing police lights acted like a beacon, drawing the wealthy and incredibly gossipy neighbors from around the block, the exact people Patricia had spent the last decade desperately trying to impress. Mrs. Gable, the powerful president of the local country club, stood at the edge of her manicured driveway, holding a steaming mug of coffee. Standing right next to her were the wives of two prominent bank executives. They watched with absolutely no shame as Patricia Wilson, the woman who used to host lavish high-end garden parties, dragged a black trash bag full of shoes across the wet asphalt, struggling to hoist it into the back of a rented U-Haul. It was absolute social death, broadcast live to the exact audience she feared most. She tried to hide her face behind her messy hair as she bolted back inside, her shoulders shaking with a fresh wave of sobs. As the 4-hour window neared its end, the tension inside the estate peaked. Brandon was the last one to come downstairs. He was moving fast, his jaw clenched, carrying a heavy rectangular object wrapped tightly in a thick wool coat. Keeping his head down, he walked straight toward the front door. "Hold on a second," Sergeant Miller said, stepping directly into Brandon's path. The officer's voice was calm, but it carried undeniable authority. "Let me see what you have wrapped up there." "It's just a mirror," Brandon snapped, his voice sharp with panic. "It's my personal property. Get out of my way. I'm just trying to leave." Sergeant Miller didn't budge an inch. "Set it on the table and unwrap it," he ordered. Brandon hesitated, his eyes darting wildly toward the exit. He held the object tighter against his chest. "I told you it's mine. You don't have a warrant to search my personal items." The officer deliberately placed his hand on his heavy utility belt. "I'm not going to ask you a second time, son. Put it on the table." His hands shaking violently, Brandon slowly laid the object onto the mahogany console table. He pulled back the folds of the wool coat. Underneath lay a stunning, original oil painting of a coastal landscape. It was a piece Grandmother Josephine had bought from a local artist decades ago, recently valued at over $5,000. The inventory auditor stepped forward, flipping through his heavy binder. His finger ran down a laminated page. "Item number 412, the auditor stated clearly. "Original coastal oil painting, property of the Josephine Blind Trust." "I bought that," Brandon lied, his voice cracking loudly. "It was a gift from her to me. It's mine." "You are currently under indictment for felony fraud," Sergeant Miller said, his tone turning dangerously cold. "Do you really want me to add an attempted grand larceny charge to your record today? Leave the artwork and exit the house." Brandon stared at the painting, then up at the officer. The illusion he had spent his entire life clinging to, the belief that he was somehow superior, untouchable, and entitled to this wealth, shattered completely. He shoved past the officer and bolted out the front door. I stepped onto the porch just in time to watch him unravel. The golden boy didn't make it to the truck. He collapsed right in the middle of the manicured front lawn. Dropping to his knees in the damp grass, he buried his face in his hands and began to wail. It wasn't a quiet, dignified cry. It was the loud, gasping, out-of-control sobbing of a spoiled child finally being told no. He pounded his fists against the ground, screaming incoherently about how unfair everything was, while his parents watched helplessly from the cab of the moving truck. The wealthy neighbors watched the entire breakdown with wide, shocked eyes. I stood perfectly still on the wraparound porch, my hands resting lightly on the polished wooden railing. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply watched in absolute silence as the people who had tried to destroy me were packed into a rental truck and driven away from my home forever. The low, rumbling hum of the moving truck faded down the long, oak-lined driveway until it was completely swallowed by the ambient city noise. For the first time in my life, the historic estate was wrapped in absolute, unbroken serenity. The suffocating weight of my parents' presence had finally dissipated, leaving behind a profound silence that felt entirely foreign. I stepped away from the porch railing and walked back through the heavy mahogany front door. The grand foyer, which used to constantly echo with Patricia's shrill commands or Richard's booming, fake authoritative voice, was dead quiet. Standing in the center of the marble floor, I took a deep breath. The air in the house still faintly smelled of stale cigar smoke and expensive, heavy perfume. It was the residual scent of unearned privilege. It was time to wash it off the walls. I didn't wait for contractors. I walked straight into the formal dining room, grabbed the edge of Patricia's heavy, tacky burgundy velvet drapes, and pulled with everything I had. The reinforced fabric ripped away from the brass tracks with a satisfying, violent tear, crashing onto the hardwood floor along with the entire rod. Sunlight instantly flooded the room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the sudden brightness. I went room to room, tearing down every suffocating drape, every heavy blind they had installed to shut out the world. Next came the junk removal crew. I stood in the center of Richard's designated study, directing the crew to haul away the massive, foul-smelling leather cigar chairs he had purchased to make himself feel like an industrial tycoon. The actual antique furniture, the collection carefully curated by Josephine and placed into the trust, remained untouched. But the cheap, gaudy modifications my parents had brought in to mask their lack of taste were dragged out the front door and dumped unceremoniously into a commercial dumpster. With every piece of junk cleared out, the estate seemed to breathe a little easier. I know I did. But true healing required more than just throwing away the past. It required building something new. I walked out the back door, across the expansive lawn, toward the guest house. Just a few months ago, this was the site of my ultimate humiliation. This was the door they locked against me during that freezing Thanksgiving blizzard, leaving me out in the cold while they laughed inside. Now it was the foundation of my future. My botanical design team arrived the next morning with a commercial fleet. We didn't just clear out the guest house, we completely gutted the interior. The dark, cramped walls that Brandon had insisted on keeping were smashed into drywall dust by sledgehammers. We opened up the roof, installing massive industrial-grade skylights that allowed natural sun to flood the space from dawn until dusk. We brought in long, raw wood drafting tables, deep porcelain sinks, and miles of industrial copper shelving. Then, the life started coming in. My team unloaded shipment after shipment of rare botanicals. We hung split-leaf monsteras and vibrant philodendrons from the exposed wooden beams. We arranged delicate, blooming orchids in climate-controlled glass terrariums. We planted massive birds of paradise and towering fiddle leaf figs that reached straight toward the new skylights. In less than a week, the cold, miserable structure where I had once been evicted was transformed into a lush, thriving, oxygen-rich design studio. The aroma of damp earth, fresh greenery, and blooming jasmine completely erased the bitter memory of that winter storm. I wasn't hiding in the shadows of the estate anymore. I was thriving right at its heart. With the studio fully operational, I directed my renovation crew to start tackling the long-overdue maintenance inside the main house. Decades of Richard and Patricia pretending to be wealthy meant they only spent money where their country club friends could see it. The structural integrity of the upper floors had been completely neglected. I sent the demolition crew into the East Wing, straight to the massive suite Brandon had occupied rent-free his entire adult life. I was in the new studio reviewing a commercial landscaping contract when my foreman called my cell phone. His voice sounded tight, completely stripped of his usual boisterous energy. He told me to come up to the second floor immediately. I found the crew standing awkwardly in the center of Brandon's oversized walk-in closet. The custom shelving along the back wall had been ripped out, exposing the bare drywall behind it. But the drywall wasn't uniform. A large rectangular section had been cleanly cut away and concealed behind a faux magnetic panel. The foreman stepped forward and pulled the panel away. Perfectly hidden between the studs of the wooden wall was a heavy steel combination safe. Brandon had claimed he had zero assets when the court ordered him to move out. He had stood on the front lawn crying that he had nothing left. I didn't waste time calling him. I called a professional locksmith. It took the technician 45 minutes with a high-powered industrial drill to bypass the locking mechanism. The heavy steel door swung open with a harsh metallic scrape. I stepped forward expecting to find hidden cash or corporate documents he used to maintain his fake tech company. Instead, there wasn't a single dollar in the safe. Sitting at the bottom of the iron box was a thick, disorganized stack of yellowed paper. I reached inside and pulled the bundle out. They were receipts, dozens of them. I flipped through the stiff carbon copies, and my blood ran completely cold as I read the letterheads printed at the top. They were from high-end pawn shops and private jewelers located 3 towns over. I scanned the scribbled, handwritten inventory descriptions on each slip: 1 vintage emerald and platinum brooch, 1 diamond tennis bracelet with a damaged clasp, 1 heavy antique gold wedding band. My heart sank. These weren't random items. These were the exact descriptions of Grandmother Josephine's most prized and valuable heirloom jewelry. For years, Patricia had complained loudly and tragically to anyone who would listen that Josephine was losing her mind in her old age, constantly misplacing her valuables. Patricia had used those lost items as her primary argument to seek medical control over my grandmother. The betrayal ran far deeper than corporate fraud or forged credit lines. They hadn't just stolen her business capital. Brandon and my parents had systematically stolen personal heirlooms from their own mother, pawned them in the next town over, and then used the losses to frame her as incompetent. The very foundation of the empire they had built was constructed on the physical and psychological exploitation of the woman who gave them everything. Those pawnshop receipts were the final lethal nail in the coffin. I didn't take my findings to confront my parents or Brandon. I didn't give them a chance to invent excuses or spin another web of lies. I simply placed the thick stack of yellow paper into a secure manila folder and drove it straight to the district attorney's office. The prosecutor used this newly uncovered evidence of systematic elder abuse and theft to completely obliterate whatever legal defense my parents had left. 6 months later, I sat in the very front row of the county courtroom gallery. The air inside smelled of floor wax and old wood, heavy with the cold, unfeeling machinery of the justice system. The heavy oak doors at the side of the room swung open, and Richard and Patricia were led to the defense table by bailiffs. They weren't in handcuffs, but they walked with the heavy, dragging steps of people carrying invisible chains. The tailored suits and designer dresses were gone. Patricia wore a plain, inexpensive beige blouse that made her look entirely pale, while Richard wore a faded gray jacket that hung loosely off his shrinking frame. They looked incredibly small, completely stripped of the arrogant authority they had used to terrorize me for years. Defense attorneys had spent weeks begging the prosecutor for leniency. Because it was their first offense, and considering their advanced age, the district attorney offered one final plea agreement. It was an offer they accepted without hesitation, facing the absolute certainty of dying inside a concrete cell if they pushed their luck to a full trial. The presiding judge, a severe woman with a zero-tolerance policy for white-collar entitlement, looked down at them from her high bench. Her expression was filled with profound distaste as she read the terms of the agreement into the official public record. "Richard Wilson and Patricia Wilson," she began, her voice carrying sharply through the quiet room. "You have entered pleas of guilty to multiple felony counts, including wire fraud, forgery in the first degree, and conspiracy. The evidence presented to this court demonstrates a staggering level of greed and manipulation. You defrauded a financially secured institution, you systematically stole personal heirlooms from your own mother, and you attempted to financially destroy your own daughter." Patricia squeezed her eyes shut, her shoulders shaking violently as the judge read her crimes aloud. Richard stared blankly at the polished wooden table in front of him. The judge continued, hammering the final nail into their social coffin. "I accept this plea agreement, but do not mistake this for leniency. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years of strictly supervised probation. You are ordered to complete 1,000 hours of community service, specifically assigned to municipal parks and environmental sanitation departments. Furthermore, the court is imposing devastating, heavy restitution fines that will be garnished from any future income you may ever receive." The gavel struck the block with a sharp crack. It was official. My parents were convicted felons. The fallout from that strike was absolute and irreversible. Their country club memberships were immediately and permanently revoked. Their entire social circle, the wealthy neighbors, the bank executives, the wealthy wives they had spent decades sucking up to, cut ties overnight. They would never pass a basic employment background check. They lost their right to vote. Their passports were heavily restricted. For the next 5 years, they would be subject to random drug testing and weekly check-ins with a gruff probation officer. Their social standing wasn't just damaged, it was permanently erased. They would spend their weekends in bright orange safety vests, picking up trash along county highways for everyone to see. Before the hearing officially concluded, the judge looked straight at me. "The court recognizes the primary victim in this matter. Ms. Wilson, would you care to make a statement?" I stood up from the hard wooden bench, smoothing down the front of my dark green tailored dress. The gallery was dead quiet as I walked down the center aisle and took my place at the podium. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't use the manufactured hysteria Patricia had weaponized throughout my childhood. Adjusting the microphone, I looked directly at the defense table. Patricia stared at the floor, tears tracking down her pale cheeks, unable to look at the daughter she had thrown out into a blizzard. Richard sat rigid, his eyes fixed on his trembling hands, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his cheek twitched. I spoke with a chilling, absolute calm, my voice echoing clearly off the high-vaulted ceilings. For years, the people sitting at that table used manipulation, theft, and cruelty to maintain a desperate illusion of wealth. They stole from the woman who raised them, pawning her personal heirlooms to fund a luxury lifestyle while claiming she was losing her mind. They defrauded banks. They stole my inheritance and attempted to steal my future. They locked me out in a freezing storm and demanded a ransom for a property they had no legal right to occupy. I paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing the air to turn heavy. I wanted them to feel the weight of every single word. They made me pay to be abused in my own home, I stated, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a scalpel. Today, that debt is settled. I stepped away from the podium without waiting for a response. I didn't look back. Richard couldn't even lift his head. He was completely broken, a hollow shell entirely destroyed by his own arrogance. I walked out of the courtroom, pushing through the heavy double doors into the bright, warm afternoon sun, leaving them behind to face the absolute destruction they had brought upon themselves. The afternoon sun felt incredible on my face as I strolled away from the county courthouse, but the peace was briefly interrupted by a notification on my phone. It was an automated email from the municipal court clerk. Brandon had officially filed a small claims lawsuit against me. With Richard and Patricia stripped of their wealth and facing years of grueling probation, my brother had completely lost his safety net. The bank of Mom and Dad was permanently closed. His fraudulent tech startup had evaporated the second the DA seized the forged corporate accounts. Desperation breeds delusion, and Brandon was the most deluded of them all. He was suing me for exactly $10,000, the absolute maximum limit for our jurisdiction's small claims court. The reason stated on the filing was sweat equity and property management compensation. He genuinely believed that because he spent years living rent-free on my grandmother's estate, destroying the property I had painstakingly restored, he was somehow entitled to a payout. 2 weeks later, I sat in a crowded, brightly lit municipal courtroom. Small claims didn't have the heavy oak and dramatic solemnity of the criminal court. It looked more like a sterile city waiting room, packed with frustrated landlords and bickering neighbors. I sat alone at the defense table wearing a sharp charcoal blazer. I hadn't hired a lawyer. I didn't need one. Brandon sat at the plaintiff's table looking entirely frantic. His designer suit hung loosely on him, unpressed and stained at the cuffs. He kept shifting his weight, bouncing his leg rapidly, glaring at me from across the aisle. When the municipal judge finally called our case, Brandon jumped to his feet. "Your Honor," Brandon began, trying to project his old manufactured confidence. "For years I served as the primary caretaker of the guest house property. I maintained the grounds. I managed the upkeep. I put my own sweat equity into improving that space. When my sister illegally locked me out, she essentially stole the value of my labor. I am simply asking for fair compensation for the improvements I made to her estate." The judge, a weary-looking older man with a zero-tolerance policy for nonsense, peered over his reading glasses. He looked at Brandon, then shifted his gaze to me. "Ms. Wilson, how do you respond to the plaintiff's claim of property improvement?" I stood up slowly, lifting a heavy black 3-ring binder from my table. I approached the bench, handing it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "I respond with photographic evidence, Your Honor," I stated, keeping my voice absolutely level. "Inside that binder, you will find date-stamped photos of the guest house taken the exact morning the court-ordered eviction took place." The judge opened the binder. The courtroom was quiet enough that I could hear the heavy plastic sleeves flipping over. "You will see holes punched into the drywall by the plaintiff," I continued calmly. "You will see burn marks on the original hardwood floors. You will see piles of rotting trash left in the corners, and custom cabinetry that he ripped from the walls in a fit of rage. Furthermore, if you turn to tab 3, you will find over $2,000 in unpaid utility bills registered under his name, which I had to settle out of pocket just to restore power to the structure. Tab 4 contains invoices from a hazardous waste removal team I had to hire just to make the space safe to breathe in again." Brandon's face turned a deep, furious crimson. He gripped the edge of his table. "That's all a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking in the small room. "Those photos are staged. She's just trying to ruin me the same way she ruined our parents." The judge brought his palm down heavily on the open binder. The sharp smack echoed through the room, instantly silencing my brother. "Mr. Wilson," the judge warned, his voice dangerously low. "I have sat on this bench for 20 years. Do not insult my intelligence by claiming this structural destruction was staged. You have the audacity to ask this court to award you $10,000 for destroying a property you had absolutely no legal right to inhabit." "It was my house," Brandon retorted, losing his grip on reality entirely. "I'm the golden boy. I was the one who was supposed to inherit it." "Your sense of entitlement is not legally binding," the judge replied harshly. "This case is entirely without merit. In fact, Ms. Wilson would be well within her rights to countersue you for the repairs. This case is dismissed with prejudice. Stop wasting this court's time, Mr. Wilson." The entire proceeding had lasted exactly 8 minutes. Brandon stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing as the judge moved on to the next case on the docket. Shoving his messy paperwork into a worn leather briefcase, he stormed down the center aisle. I took my time packing my things, following him out into the bustling municipal hallway. Brandon was pacing by the elevators, running his hands frantically through his hair. He spun around as he saw me approach. "Are you happy now?" he snarled, stepping directly into my path. "You took everything. I have nothing left. My accounts are empty. I don't even have enough money to put gas in my car. You ruined your own blood." I looked at him, feeling nothing but a cold sense of finality. "I didn't ruin you, Brandon. I just stopped paying for your life. You ruined yourself the moment you decided my hard work belonged to you." Before he could formulate his next pathetic excuse, the heavy glass doors of the courthouse entryway pushed open. A man in a sharp gray suit walked toward us with absolute purpose. In his right hand, he held a thick manila envelope. Ignoring me entirely, the man stopped directly in front of my brother. "Brandon Wilson?" the man asked. Brandon frowned at him. "Who's asking?" The man pressed the heavy envelope firmly against Brandon's chest. "You've been served." Brandon scrambled to hold the envelope, ripping open the top. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. His eyes scanned the first page, and what little color was left in his face completely vanished. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "I represent legal counsel for Monique," the man stated smoothly. "She is filing for an immediate dissolution of marriage. Included in that envelope is an emergency court order freezing all marital assets, alongside a garnishment order against your personal checking account for unpaid marital debts." Monique was a shark. She had married Brandon for the illusion of proximity to wealth. Now that he was a broke, unemployed fraud with criminal parents, she severed the tie with cold, calculated efficiency. She wasn't just leaving him, she had instructed her lawyers to drain every last dollar he had hidden away in his personal accounts. Brandon stared at the divorce papers, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold them. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely empty. He had no parents to bail him out. He had no wife to support his delusion. He had no home, no money, and no future. He was, finally, entirely broke. I walked into the elevator and pressed the lobby button, watching the heavy metal doors slowly close on the ruined remains of my brother's life. 6 months flew by in a blur of massive, unstoppable business growth. With the toxic burden of my family finally stripped away, I poured every ounce of energy into my botanical design firm. The downtown tech park project was a massive success, earning a major feature in a prominent architecture magazine. That single article created a domino effect. Within weeks, my firm was booked solid for the next 2 years, locking down contracts for luxury boutique hotels, high-end restaurants, and private residential estates across the city. The guest house, which had once been my freezing prison, was now the beating heart of the business. It was a sun-drenched, oxygen-rich sanctuary packed with drafting tables, soil bins, and hundreds of vibrant, exotic plants. But the most profound transformation happened inside the main estate. With the legal battles finally settled, I officially took back my grandmother's home. I spent the spring months erasing decades of Patricia's superficial updates. The heavy, suffocating velvet drapes were gone. The gaudy, fake gold fixtures were replaced with clean, modern lines that perfectly complemented Josephine's original antique furniture. I opened every window, letting the sea breeze howl through the long corridors, permanently washing away the residual smell of Richard's cigars and the heavy scent of my mother's perfume. To mark the official rebirth of the estate, I decided to host a garden dinner party. I wanted to fill the grounds with light, laughter, and people who genuinely cared about one another. My dinner party was the exact opposite of the events my parents used to host. Patricia's gatherings were stiff, performative affairs. They were stressful, high-stakes dramas designed to project an illusion of extreme wealth. Guests would stand around awkwardly, judging each other over cold plates of expensive caviar and ice sculptures, terrified of making a social misstep. My evening was entirely different. I hired a local farm-to-table catering company to set up rustic wooden tasting stations across the expansive back lawn. A lively jazz quartet played on the wraparound porch, their music blending perfectly with the sound of the ocean in the distance. I strung thousands of warm white lights through the branches of the ancient oak trees, casting a soft golden glow over the entire property. The estate was filled with massive, custom floral installations designed by my team, fragrant night-blooming jasmine, cascading orchids, and vibrant birds of paradise. The guest list was made up of my dedicated employees, loyal clients, and the people who stood by me when I had absolutely nothing. Meredith, my brilliant attorney, arrived in a stunning emerald suit. She was laughing loudly, holding a glass of champagne, completely off-duty and thoroughly enjoying the atmosphere. Standing next to her was Mr. Thorne, the meticulous auditor and trust trustee who had helped me uncover the full depth of my family's financial crimes. He looked incredibly relaxed, having traded his stiff business suits for a custom linen jacket. I walked across the lawn to greet them, a deep sense of gratitude washing over me. Meredith gave me a massive, genuine hug, carefully balancing her drink. "You throw a spectacular party, Sydney," Meredith said, her eyes scanning the glowing garden. "This house finally feels alive. It feels exactly the way it was always meant to be." Mr. Thorne raised his glass to me in a silent toast. "Your grandmother would be incredibly proud of you, Sydney. You didn't just protect her legacy, you completely brought it back to life. She always knew you had the backbone to do what needed to be done." I smiled, clinking my glass against theirs. "I couldn't have done any of it without you two. When I was completely cornered, you gave me the weapons to fight back. Tonight is a celebration for all of us." For the next 2 hours, I moved effortlessly through the crowd. There was no pretense, no fake pleasantries, and no hidden agendas. I watched my head botanical designer dancing barefoot on the grass. I saw my newest corporate client sharing a plate of artisanal cheese with my security guard. It was a gathering of chosen family, built on mutual respect and shared joy rather than blood ties and financial manipulation. Near midnight, as the jazz band began packing up their instruments and the catering staff quietly cleared the remaining plates, I stepped away from a conversation with my foreman and walked up the steps of the back porch, seeking a moment of quiet reflection. I stood by the railing, overlooking the illuminated garden. The air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket to check the time, the screen glowing brightly in the shadows of the porch. A new notification sat quietly at the top of the display. It was an email from a random, unrecognized address, but the subject line contained just one word: Sydney. I tapped the screen, unlocked the device, and opened the message. It was a short block of text, written without any formal greeting. "I'm working the night shift at a grocery store. Your father's back is nearly broken from clearing the highways. We lost the rental apartment. We have nothing left. Please, Sydney." I stared at the glowing letters for a long time. I didn't feel a sudden rush of guilt. I didn't feel that old, conditioned urge to rescue them from the consequences of their own actions. The words were a calculated attempt to manufacture sympathy, a desperate play from a woman who had stood in a luxury kitchen and told me I deserved to freeze on the street. They had pawned my grandmother's jewelry, drained her accounts, forged bank loans, and tried to strip me of everything to feed their vanity. Now, stripped of their stolen wealth and country club status, they were finally experiencing the exact reality they had so casually tried to inflict on me. I didn't type a reply. I didn't forward the message to my attorney. I simply hit the delete button, watching the email vanish permanently into the digital trash bin. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. From the lawn below, Meredith called my name, waving a freshly poured glass of champagne. I turned my back on the darkness at the edge of the estate, stepping back into the warm light, and walked down the stairs to join my real family. I paused at the bottom of the porch stairs, the upbeat sounds of the jazz band washing over me. My hand was still buried deep in my blazer pocket, my fingers gripping the cool metal casing of my phone. I had deleted the email. I had intended to walk away. But a deep, insidious reflex suddenly gripped my chest. It was guilt, the heavy, suffocating conditioning that Patricia and Richard had spent 30 years embedding into my brain. Growing up, I had been trained to be their emotional sponge, their ultimate safety net. A tiny, betraying voice in the back of my mind whispered that they were hurting. I pictured Richard, the man who used to strut around in custom suits, groaning in pain as he hauled heavy trash bags along public highways. I pictured Patricia, whose biggest stress used to be the thread count of imported tablecloths, standing for 8 hours under the harsh fluorescent lights of a grocery register, her feet aching. They were completely stripped of their dignity. They had no home, they had no money. The conditioned guilt tried to convince me that the punishment had been enough. "They're still your parents," the voice argued. "Leaving them on the street seems too harsh." I took a deep breath of the crisp ocean air and closed my eyes. The second I shut my eyes, the illusion of their victimhood was instantly and permanently shattered by my own memories. I wasn't standing in a warm, beautifully lit garden anymore. I was back on the front porch on Thanksgiving morning. I felt the biting, violent sting of the blizzard cutting through my thin clothes. I heard the sharp, metallic slide of the heavy brass deadbolt locking into place as my mother locked me out in the freezing snow. I remembered the burning numbness in my fingers as I huddled in the unheated, broken guest house, praying I wouldn't freeze to death on my own property. I remembered Brandon holding a sledgehammer, gleefully smashing through the drywall while Patricia stood by and cheered him on. I remembered the hollow feeling in my stomach when I opened that hidden steel safe and found the pawn slips, the undeniable proof that my parents had systematically gutted my grandmother's estate, selling her cherished heirlooms in the next town over while lying to the state that she had dementia. They hadn't felt a shred of guilt when they were actively trying to destroy my life. They laughed while I suffered. Their current desperation wasn't a tragedy, it was the earned consequence of their own malice. I pulled my phone back out of my pocket, the screen illuminating the darkness of the bottom step. I opened the trash folder and restored Patricia's message. I didn't want this hanging over me, lingering like a silent ghost in the digital ether. They needed to know with absolute certainty that the door was shut permanently. I clicked the reply button, the cursor blinking steadily against the blank display. I didn't type out a long paragraph detailing my pain. I didn't demand an apology they were incapable of giving. I didn't offer a single word of sympathy or anger. I typed one short, definitive sentence. "Have fun figuring life out on your own." I pressed send, watching the blue progress bar slide across the top of the screen until the message vanished into the outbox. Then, I opened my security settings. I permanently blocked Patricia's email address. I entered Richard's former email and did the same. I went into my cell phone carrier settings and placed a hard network block on every phone number associated with them, including Brandon's old line. I systematically cut every remaining digital thread connecting them to my existence. The heavy, suffocating anchor in my chest dissolved instantly, replaced by a profound, soaring lightness. The final boundary had been drawn in permanent ink. I slid my phone back into my pocket, leaving it there for good this time. Stepping out from the shadows of the porch, I walked back onto the wide, vibrant lawn. The garden dinner party was in full swing, pulsing with a bright, authentic energy this property hadn't seen in decades. Meredith threw her head back, letting out a genuine, unbridled laugh at a joke Mr. Thorne had just made. My head botanical designer and her partner were dancing barefoot on the grass. Members of my design crew gathered around the massive stone fire pit, sharing stories and raising a toast to the massive success of our firm. There was no tension, no fear of judgment, and no performative posturing. The air was crisp, clean, and filled with the brilliant aroma of blooming jasmine and sea salt. This was my chosen family, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared triumph. I stopped in the middle of the lawn, turning to look back at the grand estate. The warm golden interior lights poured beautifully through the massive antique stained glass window above the main staircase, the exact window Grandmother Josephine used to sit by every single morning. For a single breathtaking second, the shifting light from the interior chandeliers seemed to catch the stained glass perfectly, creating the distinct silhouette of an elegant woman standing proudly within the frame. I smiled, raising my champagne glass toward the glowing window. Josephine's legacy was finally safe, and so was I. On the other side of town, Monique was huddled in a plush velvet booth at an upscale rooftop bar, already working on finding her next host. She sat across from an older man with graying hair and a heavy platinum watch, elegantly stirring the olive in her martini, projecting the perfect image of a wounded, tragic heroine. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with manufactured vulnerability as she lamented the terrible ordeal she had just survived. She spun a brilliant tale of deception, claiming she had been ruthlessly misled by a sociopathic fraud who covered his imminent bankruptcy behind a wall of fake corporate documents. She painted Brandon as a master manipulator who had drained her personal accounts, leaving her deeply traumatized. The older man patted her hand sympathetically across the table, completely unaware that the woman sitting across from him had just ruthlessly cleaned out her ex-husband for the last few remaining coins. Learning absolutely nothing from the wreckage, Monique moved on to her next target effortlessly, completely devoid of remorse. Meanwhile, Brandon was experiencing a very different kind of reality. The stale, greasy smell of cold French fries filled the cabin of his dented rental compact car. He stared at the cracked screen of his phone mount, waiting for the delivery app to process his next route. The screen flashed green, displaying a pickup order for a fast food chain and a delivery address that made his stomach drop. It was an address deep within the Heights, the ultra-wealthy gated enclave where he used to drive on weekends, pretending to look at summer homes. He didn't have a choice. He accepted the delivery. 30 minutes later, Brandon pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of a sprawling modern mansion. Carrying 2 heavy brown paper bags leaking grease onto his cheap canvas sneakers, he trudged up the long, perfectly manicured stone driveway. He caught his reflection in the mirrored glass of the massive double front doors. The tailored suits and confident stride were gone. He looked haggard, his shoulders slouched beneath a stained promotional t-shirt, a faded baseball cap pulled low to avoid recognition. A teenager opened the door, snatched the bags without looking at him, and slammed the heavy wood in his face. Brandon stood on the stone porch for a moment, listening to the muffled laughter and wealth echoing from inside. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A notification from the delivery app. He had been tipped $2. Turning around, he walked back to his beat-up car, entirely invisible in the world he had once claimed to rule. A few miles away, the late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the shoulder of Interstate 95. The heat radiating off the black asphalt was unforgiving. Richard and Patricia moved slowly along the gravel shoulder, wearing oversized, sweat-stained neon orange safety vests with the words "Community Service" printed across their backs in heavy block letters. Cars and semi-trucks blasted past at 70 miles an hour, spraying them with hot exhaust and clouds of road dust. Patricia's hands, once perfectly manicured and weighed down by heavy heirloom rings she had stolen from her own mother, were blistered and raw inside cheap canvas work gloves. She aimed her aluminum trash grabber blindly at a discarded soda cup, missing twice before finally clamping onto it and dropping it into her bag. Richard was a few yards ahead, dragging a heavy black plastic trash bag across the rough gravel, gasping heavily for breath as his face flushed a dangerous red under the glare of the sun. A county sheriff cruiser sat parked 50 yards behind them, a deputy leaning against the hood to ensure the probationers kept working. Richard and Patricia didn't speak to each other. The resentment between them had curdled into a suffocating, toxic silence. While their former country club friends were likely sitting on shaded patios sipping iced cocktails, they were picking up fast food wrappers and discarded cigarette cartons from a drainage ditch. They had spent their entire lives looking down on manual labor, viewing it as entirely below their social class. Now they were the ones publicly humiliated in neon vests by the side of a noisy highway. A low, powerful rumble approached from the westbound lanes, distinct from the chaotic roar of commercial semi-trucks. Patricia paused, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her canvas glove, and looked up. A convoy of 3 brand-new charcoal-gray commercial vehicles cruised past in perfect formation. They were massive, heavy-duty transport trucks, hauling mature exotic trees and custom copper planters toward a high-end commercial district downtown. On the side of the lead truck, reflecting the harsh afternoon sun perfectly, was a massive, elegant logo detailed in shining gold leaf. It bore the name of my botanical design firm. Patricia froze, her eyes wide as she stared at the gleaming gold letters. The trucks roared past, creating a heavy backdraft that rustled her oversized neon vest. The reality of the moment hit her like a physical blow. The daughter she had mocked, the child she had labeled a glorified lawnmower and thrown out into a blizzard, was now commanding a luxury design fleet, literally paving the city in gold, while she stood in the dirt picking up trash. The aluminum trash grabber slipped from Patricia's trembling fingers, clattering against the asphalt as she stood completely frozen in the dust. Exactly 1 year had passed since the day that was supposed to destroy my life. On Thanksgiving morning, I woke up to the soft golden light of late autumn pouring through the massive bay windows of the master bedroom. I wasn't shivering on a damp cot in an unheated guest house. I woke up in Grandmother Josephine's antique 4-column bed, wrapped in a heavy, luxurious down comforter. The estate was quiet for only a few minutes before the pleasant, bustling energy of the holiday began to unfold. I walked downstairs, my bare feet sinking into the thick, plush carpets I had carefully chosen to replace Patricia's cold marble floors. The house smelled incredible. A rich blend of roasting turkey, fresh sage, sweet cinnamon, and the sharp, crisp scent of fresh pine garlands my botanical team had draped across the grand staircase and stone fireplaces. Last year, this house had been a freezing mausoleum of fake wealth and bitter hostility. Today, it was a vibrant sanctuary filled with genuine joy. Throughout the morning, I hung out in the expansive kitchen with my head botanical designer and my construction foreman. We weren't discussing profit margins or corporate contracts. We were laughing over a massive bowl of homemade stuffing and drinking steaming apple cider, completely ignoring the rigid, formal holiday rules my mother used to enforce. My foreman was trying to carve a decorative pumpkin into the shape of a monstera leaf, failing terribly but providing spectacular entertainment for everyone else in the room. By 2 in the afternoon, guests began to arrive. The heavy oak front door, the very door I had been locked out of 12 months ago during a raging blizzard, was thrown wide open. The crisp, cold air rushed in, carrying the distinct scent of impending snow, but it was instantly defeated by the roaring fire crackling in the foyer fireplace. Meredith arrived first. My brilliant attorney had traded her sharp business suits for a cozy knit sweater and tall boots. She walked in carrying 3 expensive bottles of wine, immediately pulling me into a massive hug. Mr. Thorne followed right behind, accompanied by his wife. The meticulous auditor looked completely at ease, handing me a freshly baked cherry pie and marveling at the floral installations hanging from the ceiling beams. Soon, the house was packed with over 40 people who had RSVP'd to my Thanksgiving dinner invitation. The guest list included my dedicated staff, close friends, the security team who had helped protect the estate, and the contractors who had worked tirelessly to rebuild the guest house. It was a wonderful mix of people from all walks of life, without a strict dress code or performative posturing to impress wealthy socialites. There was only genuine gratitude and shared warmth. As the afternoon dissolved into a crisp, dark evening, I rang a small silver bell, gathering everyone into the formal dining room. The transformation of this specific space was my greatest personal triumph. The long, heavy mahogany table occupied the center of the room, the exact piece of furniture where Patricia had casually slid a fraudulent eviction notice across the polished wood, telling me I had 2 hours to pack my life into trash bags before being thrown onto the street. Now that dark memory was completely erased by a beautiful feast. A massive, perfectly roasted turkey sat at the center, surrounded by dozens of ceramic bowls filled with garlic mashed potatoes, roasted root vegetables, and fresh, crusty bread. Hundreds of warm white candles scattered across the linen runner cast a flickering golden light, reflecting off the faces of my chosen family. I stood at the head of the table, the exact position Richard used to occupy to deliver his pompous, self-serving speeches about bloodlines and money. I looked down the length of the table at 40 faces looking back at me, their eyes bright, and their smiles completely real. The room fell quiet naturally, the clinking of silverware settling as Meredith smiled and raised her glass, signaling the others to do the same. I reached out, my fingers wrapping around the slender stem of my glass, the deep red wine catching the candlelight and shining like a ruby. I took a slow, steady breath. I didn't think about neon orange safety vests by the highway. I didn't think about the desperate emails I had permanently deleted. I didn't waste a single second of mental energy on the people who had tried to destroy me. They had been completely erased from my story. I raised my glass high. To the people in this room, I began, my voice clear and filled with absolute certainty. You are the true foundation of this home. You proved to me that family isn't just something you are born into. It is a structure you build from the ground up with respect, loyalty, and unwavering kindness. I looked toward the massive stained glass window at the end of the room, watching the interior light reflect off the colored glass. And I want to raise a glass to the woman who built this estate. Grandmother Josephine knew the true value of hard work, and she knew the incredible strength it takes to protect what matters. She left me a legacy, but more importantly, she left me the backbone to defend it. I looked back down at the table, meeting the eyes of the people who had stood firmly by my side when I had nothing. To independence, I said, my voice rich with deep joy. To the beautiful, chaotic, incredible journey of building your own life. And to the absolute certainty that no one can ever take it away from you. A chorus of cheerful agreements echoed through the room as glasses clinked together in a celebratory ring. Laughter erupted instantly, filling every single corner of the grand room. I took a sip of the rich wine, letting the smooth flavor settle on my tongue, and took my seat at the head of the table. I watched my friends pass platters of food and share stories, creating brilliant new memories over the mahogany wood. Outside, the winter snow began to fall, dusting the world in a quiet, pure white, but the freezing cold could never touch me again. The ghosts of the past were permanently banished. The war was officially over, and I was completely enveloped in the sweet, undeniable taste of a life perfectly earned. The most profound lesson to take from this story is that true self-worth is never defined by the family you are born into, but by the unwavering resilience you cultivate within yourself. When toxic relatives use manipulation and belittlement to maintain control, walking away is not an act of defeat. It is the ultimate declaration of independence. True success is the best silencer for doubt, and a chosen family built on mutual respect will always provide the unconditional love that blood relations sometimes cannot. Share your own experiences with setting healthy boundaries in the comments below.